This is On the Homefront, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Anna Deinhard. Cold, dark clouds hang over Berlin. It is Monday morning and rush hour is in full swing. At exactly 8:20, screaming sirens blare all over the city. Everything stops. Buses, trams, right where they are. Underground trains stop at the next station. Tens of thousands of private cars and trucks stand still. Countless bicycles are simply laid out on the streets. Yes, you heard me right. There are many cars in Berlin. Several million Berliners speed for different shelters which have been marked with posters and arrows on houses and asphalt. Potsdamer Platz, one of the busiest intersections in Europe, is deserted within 180 seconds. In the next 10 minutes, not a single civilian is in the open. Then, planes come roaring over the city, followed by detonations and thundering explosions. Dense dust rolls through the empty streets. Anti-aircraft guns open intense fire from numerous roofs of many buildings. People run around screaming, covered in blood, collapsing in the middle of empty lanes. Men in grey and brown uniforms and gas masks administer first aid. Fire engines speed in to put out fires. They have to navigate overturned buses, rubble and piled up stone and beam blocks protecting every city passage. The attackers approach their main target, the government quarter around Wilhelmstraße and huge industrial complexes in the northwest, especially Siemensstadt. The Reich Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, looks very pleased out of his office window and registers. Air raid alarm very early. My ministry is on fire. The whole Wilhelmplatz is destroyed. What a great spectacle. What? It is September 20, 1937. The exercise involving 10 million people in Berlin and across northern Germany is the peak event after a series of blackout night exercises where no lights of any sort are allowed. The gigantic undertaking had been prepared in detail for months and months, like a monstrous epic theatre play. With undisguised pride, Göring states, "Not only our own population, but also abroad should have recognized what National Socialist Germany is capable of achieving in this field. Our air raid drills that take place this year as part of the Wehrmachtsmanöver in the German Reich have never been done like that anywhere else before. We are prepared." The NSDAP party newspaper Völkischer Beobachter announces the next morning that not a single thinking person in our country is not convinced of the necessity of the Luftwaffe and air protection. Even Otto de Tolischus, prominent journalist for the New York Times and Pulitzer Prize winner, is impressed. With Nanking, Shanghai and Madrid as warning examples that air raids on open towns denounced as barbarous during the World War have become commonplace features of modern warfare, Berlin and all northern Germany went on a war footing today as part of the most elaborate and most realistic war maneuvers in German history. But a Berlin police officer remarks critically that the population in general lacks a certain degree of military thinking and behavior. Interest and understanding are missing. The inhabitants of the capital don't take the exercises particularly serious. But when the bombs really come, that won't be the main problem. The lack of air raid shelters will be. Joseph Goebbels is concentrated on air protection. For him, it is clear that sooner or later the Führer will go to war. 2 years later, September the 1st, at 3:30 in the morning, CBS Berlin gets the news that then spreads like wildfire. A German Stuka drops the first bomb of the Second World War. Every Berliner who has a phone is on it, while 1.5 million men of the Wehrmacht begin to cross the Polish border. But what will happen now to Berlin? The city that sings and laughs, dances and gambles. Once a metropolis of art and theatre, stronghold of fashion and avant-garde, the cultural world capital, a city where just a few years ago the new type of woman emerged. Extravagant and glamorous, but at the same time critical, satirical and politically engaged. A woman that questioned the old expectations on herself and found a very new place in society. A time of bohemians in coffee houses, in a Berlin that listened to the sound of jazz and now marches to the rhythm of war drums. How does she feel now? When the outbreak of war comes as the climax of the Nazi end to her emancipation, after she can no longer go down previously untrodden paths in a decade of the new objectivity. Does she miss that time, or does she just remember that the winds of freedom and emancipation of the 1920s also brought with them sins and debauchery? How the city became a cesspool of sexual deviants, work-shy beggars, criminals, and other antisocial elements? If she does, it's a bullshit memory. Well, that's what many people thought. But it's a wild exaggeration of everyday life in Berlin in the 1920s. The vast majority, and I mean almost everyone, are average people just getting on with life. The image of Berlin as a den of sin and debauchery is, however, propagated in media worldwide. And if you walked the city at the time, this would be confirmed. You'd see these sexual deviants everywhere. Well, that's just confirmation bias. You'd see one and your mind would conclude that there were many, many, many more, as you had been given to think from the press. But didn't the financial crisis force all of Berlin into unemployment and extreme poverty? Yes, unemployment skyrocketed and peaked at 632,000, a third of Berlin's population. The people dependent on the city's welfare system rose from 72 out of 1,000 people to 138 from 1930 to the end of 32. But by the time that the Nazis seized power in March 1933, these numbers were already in decline. And what about the political violence? Wasn't Berlin the capital of Marxist agitators and troublemakers, driving Germany towards another socialist revolution and Soviet rule? Violent streets fighting communists being fought back by the Nazis? Another misconception. Sure, there was a vibrant German far-left movement, especially in Berlin, but any real prospect of revolution had died by 1923, when also the Soviet Union reduced its previously generous support for communist movements. The violence was coming from the Nazi SA, systematically attacking any political opponents on the left. But the perceived problems is why people supported the Nazis, right? Well, not in Berlin. You see, Hitler and his boys were not very popular in the capital, and they knew it. Goebbels, Gauleiter in Berlin, faced real problems recruiting people in the city. Instead, he shipped in supporters from the countryside and other cities. Hitler finds Berlin so unwelcoming that he made Munich his base of operations, which after the Nazi take power means that Munich remains the Nazi party capital and Berlin is the nation's capital, but also run by the Nazis, of course. Hitler, though, keeps his headquarters moving, and wherever he is the Führers Hauptquartier, the Führer's headquarters. Okay, but back to the days just before the war. By then, things have changed. The Nazis have gained more support in Berlin. In 1938 and 39, Hitler is spending most of his time in Berlin. The sexual deviants are gone. The homeless are gone. No more prostitution, no more political violence, and unemployment is pretty much a thing of a distant past. The new, cleaned-up city, decked in the vibrant colors of red flags with shining white circles and black swastikas, looks like a Nazi success. And Berliners go beyond just looking the other way, and the vast majority get behind the Nazi cause. Because the Nazis cleaned up the city, right? They sure did. They put all the non-desirables in camps. The people of Berlin get another version fed to them, though. It's the success of the Göring Plan to get everyone in Germany into gainful employment that begins in 1934. Except, it turns out that people don't want to be shipped to the countryside into hard labor for almost no pay. Only a mere quarter of the recruitment goals are met. But when people don't sign up voluntarily, the Nazis simply arrest them. Literally tens of thousands of ordinary unemployed people and anyone the Nazis deem antisocial, but not antisocial enough for a concentration camp, are put in forced labor camps. The political violence is also not gone. The Nazis have just stopped attacking political opponents in the streets and moved that violence into the concentration camps. Street violence is now limited to the occasional attack of Nazi gangs on defenseless Jews, a small number of people who are not part of the concept of us anymore. So it gets little attention. Prostitution and nightclubs are most certainly not gone. It's just no longer visible to the men and women on the streets. And the ladies of the night now have a new main clientele, the Nazis. And it's not just me saying that. The Nazis spent a lot of written policy words on how important prostitution is to keep the Nazi men motivated and happy. And by the time of the war, they built state-run bordellos for the soldiers all over the place. So, under the surface, nothing has changed, and soon the hard reality of war will reveal that illusion of progress for the lie that it is. By 1941, Hitler is also largely gone. In the years from 1941 to 44, he will never spend more than 8 weeks in a year in the capital, often only as little as 10 days. Hitler's declining presence is a sign that the changes that war brings to Berlin. The first few months after the invasion were not so bad. Right after the outbreak, dancing events were forbidden, but by early 1940 it was permitted again, and going out to dance again quickly became Berliners' favorite entertainment, especially the younger adults. Life went on, and as the war raged far away, it seemed not very different than early 1939. The cinemas were open, the shops were still full of produce, no real rationing yet. In fact, Hitler on purpose avoided rationing as long as he possibly could. He wanted the German people not to feel the daily cost of the war he had begun. Then came the first air raid on the night of June 7 to 8, 1940. A single plane of the Armée de l'Air. More scattered raids followed that summer and fall. Not much of a threat, but a worrying sign, as Rolf Bayer, a little boy at the time, remembers. The first bombs that fell in the fall of 1940 were something special for us children. We looked for bomb splinters and collected them. But the more bombs fell, the more we realized how terrible they were, and the greater our fear became when the alarm went off. So the blackouts returned. But even with every window, every entrance covered, no lights anywhere, it still seemed kind of normal at first until it suddenly was not. By now in mid-1944, the Allied air raids on Berlin have been many and devastating. Rolf continues. From the fall of 1943, the air raids on Berlin increased massively, which further worsened our living conditions. The first news of imminent bombing raids was on the radio. Information was given there when bomber squadrons had flown into German airspace. The German defenses, whether fighters or anti-aircraft guns, were mostly destroyed. The American and British bomber squadrons were always protected from German attacks by their own fighters flying with them. Since protection was now rarely needed, the fighters joined in the destruction and hunted people on fields and streets at low altitude during the daytime. Since alerting the population didn't always work, we always went to bed with our clothes on. When bombers were on the move, then we could quickly grab our suitcase and bag and run down to the basement. Sometimes women ripped laundry from the washing lines, grabbed the incendiary bombs and threw them out of the attic window onto the streets. They exploded below, but could no longer cause any damage on the stone pavement. Since there were white spots everywhere afterwards, it was clear that it had been the dangerous phosphorus incendiary bombs. In Berlin, everyone, whether adult or child, had put on a gas mask during the alarm. By now, tens and tens of thousands of Berliners have fallen as soldiers or remain missing. Tens of thousands of Berliners opposed to Nazism or undesirable are languishing or have died in the Nazi concentration camps. Some 50,000 Jewish Berliners have fallen victim to the Nazi racial mania in the murder factories in occupied Poland. 1.5 million people, anyone not performing war-essential work, have left the city. About 25,000 civilians, mostly women, children, the elderly, Allied POWs, and slave laborers from occupied territory have died in the bombings. But not even that has broken Berlin's support for the Nazi war. Like everywhere else that is bombed, it has hardened the will to go on, to fight back even when it's for a terrible cause like Nazism, because it has become about each and everyone's own survival. And it isn't over yet. Many more will die. 80 million cubic meters of rubble will pile up. More than a third of the total living space gone. Countless monuments will lay in ruins, and in the Middle District, 70% of all buildings will be destroyed or unusable. Here alone, more than 20 churches of artistic and historical value are devastated. How can civilian life in 1944, mostly women and children, ever be prepared for war? Then or now?